Internet. We are the 66 Think Tank. My name is Jay Foster. With me this evening I have Chris.
I'm Brian Isaac, from the internet and 2D 6 Feet in a Random Direction podcast, well faded but still alive.
And myself, Chris Tregenza, from the UK. So we're spanning the world today.
Yes, we've got ourselves 8 hours apart. Here it's currently midnight in Hong Kong. We've got Chris rattling on at what I believe is 4 p.m. In the UK, and Brian joining us at 8 a.m. from the west coast of the far thin continent that's over in the west. So yes, the topic for our think tank, our cross-continental think tank tonight, is social combat. Now, this was something that Brian raised on our G+ community about the idea of seeing if we can refit 66's combat rules in some way, shape, or form that you can have an argument with it. So Chris and I had a quick chat a couple of weeks ago about this idea, and we think, well, actually, this would make a half-decent thing for a short little or a small grouping with a bit of a think tank. So, Brian, it was your idea that kind of kicked us off. What was your initial thinking on how this might work?
I think my initial thinking was kicked off by Sophia Brandt's comment on the system. I think she was doing a review, and she had just noted that the combat system is pretty rich, and there's a number of options for non-combat challenges and resolutions. But if, you know, the idea being if you're playing a negotiator, something near and dear to my heart, and you know, you're looking for heavy social interaction scenes, you know, you might want the rules to go as deep as they do in combat for social, right? It's that old chestnut. And as I was thinking about that and looking at the rules, I realized, well, it could be as simple as just adding an additional keyword to some select advantages, in this case, social. I mean, if you wanted to do some type of weird medical show, I suppose you could add different medical tags and run, quote, conflict or combat. But that was the thinking. And then just run a conflict, but instead of physical damage and blarging and talking about physical elements or mystical elements of combat, it's focused on social position and how you're doing in that social challenge or conflict.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a good idea, and the social keyword is something we perhaps look at. So, Chris, was this something you thought up when you were first looking at the construction of the 66 system?
Yes, very much so. It's something I considered because, yeah, once you sort of, because of the way the 66 works, it's a very simple mechanic. You can apply that same mechanic to lots of circumstances. I didn't choose to really develop that idea and left it very much in the rule, very much vague in the rules about what to do if you want to roll dice in social situations, because I thought I'm not sure what situations you want to do, and I think it might be quite limiting if you said, oh, social combat has to be done like this. I think it's going to be something. Social stuff is very wishy-washy, and I think we need a mechanic which fits lots of different situations and styles.
Yeah, no, it's certainly an important thing. I mean, because there's very different types of social contexts you can get into. Now, the social combat in the style that I've been thinking of, it tends to drop almost into the concept of a duel. Now, duels are handled very differently depending on the system. And they have very odd effects compared to large multi-character combat where ambush or awareness of what's going to encounter can kick in. If you're just one-on-one, who goes first has a very significant effect on almost everything that goes on. Now, in 66, if I'm the attacker and the defender rolls better than I don't actually suffer any consequences. Other than the fact that my attack missed, I don't take damage. Now, there are other systems I've come across where when you do a competing role in a duel situation like this, whoever wins does damage. So you don't have the problem of who goes first. It's simply a case of you both put together your roles, you roll off, because there's only two of you in the combat. So essentially taking turns doesn't make any sense. You both attack each other at the same time, and then you compete with the roll-off. So with 66 at the moment, if you were to have a duel in the kind of a social combat, so let's take let's riff off Age of Legends. The Greeks were really keen on having very formal, stylized debates. So you'd have two people, they would adopt opposing ideological principles, and they would then argue the merits of each other in a stylized format. They'd almost be marked on how well they stuck with the format as they would be the quality of their arguments inside that format. Now, that's a duel situation, which I can imagine a social combat where you're taking turns and managing potential will work really, really well. Which I think is more on the lines of perhaps what you were thinking, Brian.
Yeah, I think so. Although I like where you're going, and I think there's a number of different ways for it to manifest. Suddenly, I was thinking of Age of Legends, the Athenian debate supplement.
Yeah, no, I was thinking something you could do on this is, it's talking about it's working out what types of social combat or what types of social situation do we think would model on this. And Chris, you've got some thoughts?
Yes, I mean, we've mentioned 2 or 3 already. I mean, Brian mentioned in passing negotiation, which I think is quite an interesting one. You've got this sort of straight up face-to-face duel, effectively, which might be, husband and wife. That's a duel in many respects. Then also something like the debate, and in some ways the debate is more about persuading third parties, especially in a situation with a jury or some sort of voting body. That's again a slightly different social combat. And one of the things which social combat is different from physical combat, which we need to look at, is what's the conclusion. In physical combat when it ends, because all the bad guys are dead or incapacitated or have run away. Social combat, there needs to be an end point everyone recognises, and then you can tally up who's won, who's lost.
Yeah, no, that's the tricky bit. Sorry, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. What comes up for me initially is maybe to pull a page. I'm thinking about how the fate system handles conflict, and by equivalent in that, when you are out of all your social advantages, if we're translating it to 66, the winning party, then they get their way. They won their argument. You've conceded. Every argument's been shut down. You've been trapped by logic, and you now have to essentially give them what it is they're wanting, which is why they engaged in the social conflict with you, at least in part. And that may give you the option, if I'm also thinking about fate, of saying, before you lose all your social advantages, you might simply choose to yield and therefore get a stake in what the outcome is. They get their way, but you get something as well. It's not a full victory, but that's what you get for tapping out. But it's you're right, it's different results and reward, if you will, at the end of a social conflict completely.
I mean, just taking the list Chris has popped up in the chat, the negotiations case, so you've got two groups or two factions, and they're trying to negotiate some kind of contract between them. So obviously, one of them is a seller of goods, one of them is a buyer of goods, and then you've got to negotiate on the price, or it's a more complex contract. It's a treaty between nations. I mean, that's more things. So there's many, many, many little points on border changes, tariffs, arms races, who can still have alliances with others. There's the pressure from outside, external stakeholders. That's the kind of thing we can easily imagine that you could do gradiate values of success. So the party representing the nation of Fredonia against the nation of tortoises, then you can easily get into a situation where we want this and they want that. So you start completely apart, and the negotiations essentially represent who won. And at some point you can go, well, actually, this is a good point for me to concede. but you're still at a position there where if you could tap out, there's nothing to stop your opponent from pushing on. In the combat, an actual physical combat situation is, I can put my hands up and say no more. There's nothing to stop Chris as the GM going, well, actually, the troll still wants to eat you, and then they carry on the combat. I may be losing, but then it's the nature of, at what point do you decide, well, I want to give or take? It's generally on the case that you would get to a point whereby, in physical combat, where your opponent would no longer wish to do any damage to you because they've reached a point where they've achieved their objectives, and to go any further would cause them harm. So in a negotiation, that's tricky because it's simply a case of what point you are on a scale, tipping left or right. So in that case, you could almost put there to be a time limit or a round limit on it, perhaps. It's like whether you go so far in the negotiation, and after a certain number of rounds, or if there's a certain amount of potential that can be spent, it stops, and then you get a certain amount of points, or each round is an argument on a point. So the treaty's got 5 major points on it. Each round is an argument on that point, and depending on who wins that point, swings the treaty backwards and forwards across it. So you end up with a much more complex distribution rather than it being completely one-sided. With the debate, you're in a situation as well, who you're trying to persuade, the audience. In that case, it's a clear binary yes or no. So that would be a social debate to the death, or whatever they put it. It'd be to the win. It's like everyone says their piece, and whoever has the most points at the end is the yes or no winner. So it's whether or not we want to try and think about a system that's going to manage all of these, or are they so different that they're going to need subtlety.
Well, I think it's a application of the existing system. And one of the things I like is we're not really talking about needing to change or invent anything whole cloth. It's how do we use the existing tools? But I think, with the negotiation versus the debate versus anything else, and even thinking about the combat, the physical conflict, also the fictional constraint, like, why are you here? What did you get into, right? So if I, in the middle of a combat, realize I'm down to my last life advantage and throw up my arms and say, okay, please don't murder me. I'll give you my money. I'll work for you. Please, Chris, don't run me through with the sword. That gives Chris an opportunity to say, well, I really want him dead, but I might benefit from him conceding. And so the fact that I'm willing to throw in changes the fictional constraint. Now, if Chris is not playing himself or a Chris-like character, but is playing a wild boar, I'm probably going to die if I surrender. Similarly, the negotiation or the debate, I think in some cases you may be able to throw in. In the other cases, if I think about, probably poor example, but Chamberlain in World War II, conceding really wasn't conceding anything. That wasn't, if you're debating for whether you're going to be invaded or not, you either concede early, in which case you suffer the full disadvantage, maybe you get a stake, or the arena simply won't allow you to end. I think your debate point makes it. You can't kind of split the debate or semi-concede and try and come out with it. It's in a public arena. It's to the death.
What occurs to me from this is that because there isn't a clear end point, and there also isn't a clear negative mechanical thing, because in real combat, you get hurt, and even if you win the fight, there's still that cost. Whereas social combat, it's not so clear what that cost is. I'm wondering whether we need some system where social combat is almost a bit formalized, that maybe we have it a set number of rounds, 3, 4, 5 rounds, and they follow a certain formula. But before you start, everybody going into that has to declare a win situation, as in, what do they consider a victory, what do they consider a loss, and maybe what do they consider a reasonable compromise. And then, because you've stated that at the beginning, when the combat's resolved, however that happens, that's what the player has to stick to.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Going in, and at the very least, all the players, parties in the combat stating what it is that they're looking to get, I think is definitely, it's kind of assumed in combat. Plus the physicality of it allows you to kind of roll around and, I can capture you instead of killing, and that's fine. That's a tactical nuance. But social, you really need to know, why are you getting into it? Like, what are you hoping to get from the other party? And then I agree. I think then the stakes, as well as I think just pushing the 66 rules. There's also the in-system results of, you may have lost the ability to use some socially tagged advantages or some socially keyworded advantages until you get to recover them, which may not be it could be a different scale. You may not be able to recover it for a day, a week, a month, until you throw a really nice party and the GM allows you to make a roll.
Yeah, I mean, this leads us nicely onto some of the ideas of how mechanically we could work this. Now, the trick with the social situation is there are other little subtleties in it that just occur to me. If I'm attracting my troll with my warhammer, it's like, I want to do that troll physical damage. It rolls its defense. I roll my attack, and the difference is, if I've walked up to a guard who I would rather be somewhere else, and I've decided I want to do this socially, it's like, I will give you 5 gold pieces if you go and take a break. And the guard turns around and says, 10. That doesn't actually become a social combat in the style of thing we're talking about. I don't think it's a simple example, because that's a narrative decision on my part, whether or not I want to give him 10. It's like, it's an extra 5 gold pieces. How valuable to me is it him not being there?
Yeah, and I think you have to have, I think part of it needs to be, there needs to be some ability to engage, right? Both parties need to have some reason, whether they like it or not, to engage. If I want to have a social conflict with a god, I'm going to be ignored unless I've done a certain sacrifice that obligates the god to interact with me somehow and not just kill me.
Very much so. So, yeah, Chris, any thoughts on mechanically ideas on how we could do this, just to start thinking about it? I mean, the standard template would be to start with the existing combat rules.
Yeah, I have a feeling that's a bit of a red herring. I mean, partly because, this cost of losing, and Brian, you mentioned, you could lose certain advantages in the same way you do with physical damage, but narratively you can explain away physical damage. You can even, lose a soul card. You can lose your social card because you've been hurt, because you're so pissed off you don't want to be helpful to anybody. But in a social situation, if I lose an argument, it's hard to justify losing my ability to debate or something like that. So my gut feeling is that just sort of straight swapping, physical combat for social combat isn't quite right. I think that maybe we should either think about something which more focuses on potential damage and just make social combat all about potential damage and possibly status effects, or we actually look at it from a different angle and look at it as a challenge, because we already have rules in the system for ongoing challenges, and one of the examples in the rules is about persuading a guard to prison guard to let you have a pen and pencil, or to send a message, I think it was. So it's possible that we could do something there, that it becomes an extended challenge rather than a straight-off combat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I like the idea of at least modeling with the combat, just for the kind of if you will, the equity in situations to the depth of the rules. But I think you're probably more spot on of, that could be a red herring, and really applying it. I think Chris Edwards had also commented a little earlier on the community site about that idea of using the potential. And I think that may be a great way to go, as well as the second one that you mentioned in terms of just challenges.
Yeah, I mean, potential is good, because losing all your potential we've already got a mechanic, and in physical combat means you're knocked out or incapacitated. So it's easy to say that, well, if you lose all your potential, you storm from the room or whatever, concede, lose whatever the argument is. So it gives us that sort of nice, definitive finish point.
Yeah, and losing potential, certainly, it seems to make more sense in terms of translating the mechanic into the real world, rather than losing life advantages. I mean, one idea that Chris and I had when we discussed it very briefly a couple of weeks ago was on the idea of what we would do. We'd switch the combat round. So the status effects would stay the same, but the default was that attacks damaged your potential, and unless you had a particular keyword, say, for example, the social one Brian mentioned, they didn't actually target your life advantages. So that what you were doing in social combat was reducing your opponent's ability to act, rather than in physical combat where you're reducing the number of advantages that your opponent has to act with. And the special move is attacking their advantages. So, for example, I've traded a few rounds with Chris's philosopher about the meaning of life. And it's got to the point where I'm realizing that his character is really heavily relying on social contract arguments, because he keeps using his society advantage. So I'm going to put together basically an argument rather than an attack, where I specifically use my advantage, which is say heckle, which is already one that does a potential attack, and particularly niggle him in that thing, so that the result of that is an attack on his life cards, on his life advantage. So that's an option. The other thought I had was what Chris was just saying about using complex actions or ongoing challenges, is a way you could time limit those. Because with a debate, you could go, you've got 4 rounds, or you've basically got it, whoever gets to this threshold first wins the argument, would be a way of doing it. So the target's 50, the difficulty is hard. So you've got to make really good arguments, and whoever gets to, say, 50 first wins the debate. Which means if you've got several people, I mean, English British parliamentary style, we've got 4 people each side, and they take turns across the side. The guys on the end aren't doing anything. It's a good chance, decent chance that the guys at the front might win the argument for them. Whereas I quite like the idea of there's no limit on the number of rounds the task takes, but you are limited by the amount of potential you have.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, playing around with recoup rules, it would be an interesting one. If you said in social combat there's no recoup, that would sort of like really change. It would put a very strict time limit on social combat and change the emphasis. Or you recruit half, or something else. There's ways to play with the potential and which of course characters need to act. So by playing potential, you can manipulate the end point of the social combat.
Yeah. And there are several advantages you could weave into this on the lines of any advantage that lets you do this kind of things with your recoup or doing nothing, that kind of thing. Because I can easily imagine, I've got these number of points. So, and particularly, I mean, I've done debating when I was at university, and it'd be a case of the first proposition stands up, and they lay out the 3 key arguments. And the second prop comes up and mostly just expands on those key arguments. The third prop has their aim to do something new, the fourth just does summary stuff. So essentially your potential represents the arguments you've got to make, and then the advantages represent how good you are going to be at making. So I've started a generic character, I've got 6 potential. If I blow it all in one go, it's like, here's my argument. Bang, here's my argument. I've got an amazingly good initial argument. And the other guy goes, okay, well, I'm going to go 2d6, 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 and I'm going to knock down each one of your points in turn. But if he's, all right, okay, I can only spend 2d6 at a time, but that's on a d6 plus 4 and a d6 plus 4.
Yeah. I mean,
so it's got the potential to, the potential management, I think, could be something we could look at.
One other way of tackling social combat, which we've only touched on briefly, is with status effects. So there's, things, the obvious things like, we've got ones like befuddle. you can just talk someone to a confused, or we could even have convinced, as a status effect. So, we've all been in that situation where we've talked to someone, particularly a salesman, who's convinced you that you want to buy this product, and half an hour later you're going, "Why did I buy this?" And then that's just a status effect. For a short period of time, you are under the influence of something. So the scope there, and that sort of especially gives you lots of sort of potential for advantages which inflict particular status effects. So that's like another strand we can introduce of existing rules into a social combat situation. Jay, you muted?
I was going to hand over to Brian.
And I was nodding my head. Good radio.
So you're Brian. Any more thoughts?
No, I don't. I think probably I got it, just from the think tank discussion. As a GM, I'm probably walking away with right now a couple more ideas of how I might handle some potential social conflicts that could come up in my 66 Magic game. So, worth the price of admission, but nothing new's coming up.
Yeah, it's there's to get to kind of what is it's just like trying to. What we've got so far is kind of summarized is several different ways you could try and handle social combat. You could literally just transpose the rules across, and so rather than attacking with a warhammer, you're attacking with an argument, and then just run that through. And if anyone wants to give it a try and actually playtest it, I would be very interested to see how it works out. We already have the abstraction of a character losing their society or their spite in combat. It's like, so I no longer believe in society. I can still wield the sword, fine. And then you'd flip that around in social combat. You'd find characters going, well, I'm arguing over the meaning of life or whether or not we should go to war with Sparta or not. And suddenly I feel less manually dexterous. So we can look at that. There's the idea of challenge or long-time complex tasks or complex actions and challenge targets where we look at managed potential. Is there anything else I've missed out, Chris? You're muted.
Yeah, the role of status effects and potential attacks, it is really sort of a subtlety of both those approaches we can look at. It's I've got a kind of feeling that one size isn't going to fit all. And it will certainly have a very 66, if we presented 3 different options for social combat, that's very much a 66 mentality. If I had to sit down right now and write a set of rules, I would probably go down the status effect route, and that maybe what it is that you have a status effect, of convinced or whatever the goal of the argument is, and if that status effect gets to a certain number of points, you've lost. So then the player can either sort of like ignore the status effects they've already got and just attack the other player, or they can spend their potential sort of reducing the current status effect, unconvincing themselves. So it gives us like a different flavour. But that's like my personal taste, because I just don't think we use status effects enough in the game. But it's certainly not going to be the right solution for every situation.
Yeah. No, I think that's pretty good. So Brian, any final thoughts?
No, but awesome. Another reason I love the rule set, it's so adaptable.
Yeah, there's certainly plenty of ways we can look at taking existing mechanics we've got and quite quickly adapting them into several different ways. So Chris, any quick final thoughts?
Yes, just that there's a bit of me which goes, we should do something, or somebody should do something, and actually try and just write these down, because I always find with rules they're very easy to come up with in a discussion, but it's only when you write them down that you see the weaknesses or potentially strengths in a set of ideas. So I'm a bit busy at the moment with a Kickstarter, but should Jay or Brian, you or anyone else wish to have a go, then go for it, and we'll have a look at it and we'll do a play test. I would love to see something written down about this.
Yeah, it's, there's something about this, Chris. We're spending too much time talking. We're thinking of something. Before you said that, I just sent myself an email to my work account entitled "The 66 Social Supplement." And I'm going to start my plan was on at some point the next week I was going to start sketching out some notes. So the rough idea for the document I have is basically we just outline in terms of just quick notes and rules all the ways we just discussed of this is how 66 could potentially add more depth to your social interactions, or how you add more depth to your social interactions in 66. Pick and choose and change.
Just one thing, because I made a note earlier and I've forgot to come back to it. One thing we've got to consider is player agency, as in player versus player combat, or the GM forcing the player to do something. And we're fairly clear in the game is that players have complete agency. They don't have to do anything they don't want. Mechanically, we don't give many options for allowing you to take over another character. So I think we've got to hedge the rules in that sort of context. It's something a player has to willingly enter. They have to choose to enter social combat and accept the consequences, or we can just sort of refuse it, and therefore the group has to find another way to resolve the situation.
Yeah, I mean, just looking down the list of things we've got, so something a negotiation on the lines of, well, you try and persuade the guard, you had several rounds with this, you try to persuade the guard to go, and his loyalty is too strong. He cares about his job, or he cares about something. Basically, this guard will not move. So you have been unable to persuade him. It's a lot of the times you're going to get RPG characters, it's very rarely they're ever going to bump up against the kind of character who's going to turn around and say, I am the evil overlord, and here's why you should work for me. That is something I'd be interested in trying, but then the players, unless the guy actually just takes control of their mind, there's nothing stopping the players from at some point just going, well, actually we were lying, or we don't think we're bound by this, or you just say, yeah, you've made a convincing argument, but you've not necessarily persuaded me, because the players ultimately get to make a decision. Unless the guy is using some kind of mind control magic, a lot of the time I can see a lot of social combat and that kind of thing would be a debate. So you'd have the evil overlord, you'd have the players, and you'd have a tribe of goblins.
Mm-hmm.
And the result of the compulsion, if the result of the argument, is who are the goblins going to fight with?
Yeah.
It's very rarely going to get in a situation where, a hostage situation, so I think Chris, like, you've been able to talk them down, they demand these things. Do you get them or not?
Yeah, it's just something to keep in mind, because this is one of those areas which you do hear horror stories of how it's abused, and even without the sort of horror side of things, or the deeply unpleasant side of things, which sometimes come up, the general question is, players like to keep control of their own characters, and so that has to be something which is factored in the social thing, because traditionally that's an area where players have always had control over characters.
Yes. So it's more the case of I was thinking, it's like the social combat, the result of that is going to be a change in the player's circumstance, the framework they're currently working in. The guy's not going to buy the sword for more than this. You're not going to be able to sell the sword for more than this. The guard won't move for any amount of money. That doesn't mean you can't offer him something else. But your attempts to bribe the guard fail. The terms of the treaty between your country and the country you've been previously at war with are this.
Yeah.
This is the framework you now have to work within. You don't necessarily have to abide by the treaty, but there will be consequences for you not doing that. So you may have signed the piece of paper that buy the washing machine. There will be consequences if you try and back out of it. So yeah, no, I think this has been pretty useful. Thanks, Brian, for raising the point. I think that you might have earned yourself an extra bit of supplement.
No worries. Thank you.
Grand. Okay, all right, thank you very much. I've been Jay Foster. I've been talking today with Chris Jagender and Brian. Is it Ishikoff? I pronounce your surname? Ishkov?
Isaacov.
Isaacov. Okay. So yes, I've been me, they've been them. Thank you very much for watching the Think Tank, and hopefully we'll see you again not too soon. And in the interim, if you happen to be wandering through, please back the Kickstarter for Age of Legends.
Bye bye.